Welcome to my YouTube channel, Surowicz Watercolor. At any time during this video, you can click on the lower right hand corner to subscribe. This is the narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting, Empty Nest. The photograph on the right was a reference for this painting. I like the relationship between the tree and the building and how they come together to form one larger dark valued shape. I also like the feeling of distance in this. Those mountains are far away and I wanted to capture that feeling in this painting. Before I begin, I'll go through the colors that I used in this painting. Sap green, royal blue, cerulean blue, manganese blue, quinacridone burnt orange, rose madder quinacridone, and Hansa yellow light. I've done a light sketch with a beat pencil on a quarter sheet of 140 pound cold press lanaquarel, so it's 11 inches by 15 inches. And I've drawn the major shapes of the building, the shapes that make up the distant landscape, and just given an indication of the placement of the trees, but I haven't really put a lot of detail in anywhere else in the painting. I'll begin my painting with a very light wash of cerulean blue that has just a touch of thinned out quinacridone burnt orange in it, just to neutralize the blue a little bit. And you can see this is very light value. I just want to tint the sky the slightest bit. I'm working wet on dry, and I'm going to cut this wash around the shape of this building, and I'm going to bring it down to the base of the distant tree line. I'm working with a 1-inch flat brush. My board is tilted at about a 20-degree angle, so I have gravity pulling on that pigment, and you can see I don't really care. I'm not concerned about painting over these trees. I'm actually going to come back into this wash working wet and wet, using some colors to give some very soft edge suggestions of these distant tree lines. My paper is saturated, and now I'm coming in with a round wash brush that's loaded with a mixture of sap green that's been toned down just a little bit with some rose madder quinacridone. And you can see that the paint stays where I put the initial wash. It's only going to go where the paper is wet. And I can just drop this sap green mixture in here, and it's just going to diffuse a little bit. Gravity's going to pull it down, but it's not going to run over to the white paper. It's going to follow the path of least resistance, which is the wet paper. And this is just giving a light suggestion of these trees. I'm going to dry this, and I'll come back later and I'll be doing more on top of it and some work behind it. But I want to give this slight indication now that helps create some of the softness that you can't get later on in the painting process. Next, I'm coming in with a number 4 small round brush here. And I've got a mixture that has a little manganese blue and some royal blue in it. And just a touch of sap green. And I'm giving an indication of this distant mountain. And things in the distance, they take a bluish cast, so I'm trying to play that up with this. And I'm contrasting the hard edges here against the soft edges of the trees that I first put down. And I'm getting darker in value. But I'll be coming back over the area where I put in the light green wash, the soft edges, and I'll be putting in a darker value green mixture. I'm going to come in, I'm going to put in a mountain or foothills that are closer to us, and I want to keep a clean edge on that, so I've dried my paper once again as I apply this mixture here. That's a blue-green, and it's a mixture of royal blue with a little sap green in it. So now this area that, like I said, is foothills or closer mountains to us are a darker value than the lighter blue-green tone that I put down to begin with. And they're both darker than the tree shapes I put in there, but I'll be coming back over that with another darker wash, as I said. So here now I have 2 layers of these mountain ranges, and I'll use that tissue to soften that up just a little bit. So the blue-green is a little darker value, feels closer to us than the one that has a stronger blue tint to it and is farther away. I've dried my paper once again, and now I'm going to come back in. I'm going to be working wet on top of this. I could have gone a little stronger with the green wash earlier and worked some of this in. You have to be careful when coming back in over the sky area, where it's a very light mixture of cerulean blue, and that can get agitated and it'll change the color a little bit there, but I'm okay with that. So now I'm working wet and wet. I have a mixture of sap green with some rose madder quinacridone. I'm also going to take some sap green that has a little bit of quinacridone burnt orange and a little bit of royal blue. You'll notice that I turned my board upside down. So I want that darker green value to move in the direction away from the horizon line there to give the suggestion of trees, and the easiest way to do that is to turn the board upside down and continue working wet and wet. The wash that I've just put down there working wet and wet seems fairly dark value when compared to what I put down prior to that, but it's really not much more than a dark middle value. So I'm going to go a little deeper with the value. Again, I'm using the same colors here, just a richer mixture of sap green, quinacridone burnt orange with a little bit of rose madder quinacridone. And you can see that I can get much darker than what I had down there. So if you look closely, right now there's 3 layers of this wet and wet wash. The first one that I put down, initially the very light sap green layer, then I came in there with a working wet and wet and put down a layer, and then I put a darker layer on top of that, still working wet on wet into that. And it'll provide kind of 3 levels of value and softness. This is where watercolor gets its personality in the wet stage. Now I'm just going to drop some darker value mixtures here to this tree to the left. Now I'm going to take a plastic scraper here and drag some of that color down while it's still wet, just to break that edge up a little bit so it doesn't look like it was painted with a paintbrush as much. So I've taken that dark value and I've drug it down, and I'll be putting a lighter valued wash over that later. Okay, insert the reference photo in the top left here, and I'm going to start to work on this area that is kind of behind, beside, and in front of this building structure. You have a large tree here in the background, and then you have a large tree or bush here in the foreground. And it all kind of comes together as a big shape, and that dark value that's in the lower part of that grouping of trees is as dark as the big opening in the side of the building here. And they kind of run together value-wise, and they make a shape. So I'm painting this as a large shape. I'm not trying to pick out individual trees per se right now. I'm putting down this wash, and I applied it wet on dry, but now I'm going to start working wet on wet, much as I did on the left side there. But this time I'm going to stay a little cooler with my colors, so I'm not putting as much quinacridone and burnt orange in the mixture, and it's going to lean more towards the cool side, and it's going to help define a little bit better the spatial relationship between what's going on here with these trees and shadows and what's going on in the distance where it's a little bit warmer. It's a little bit more sunlit out there perhaps, but it helps differentiate where things are in space. I'm going to take my plastic scraper and pull some of this color down to break up this edge once again. And I think a lot of times when people are using scraping tools and they're trying to scrape positive light shapes into dark backgrounds, and don't often consider that you can scrape down or scrape in another direction and actually create interesting negative space. Now I'm on the other side where I had scraped down some before, and now I'm working with some lighter middle values, and this is a gold tone that is mixed with hands of yellow and some rose madder quinacridone in there and a touch of burnt orange. And I've integrated some of the green mixture into that brush stroke, so that gold tone just gradates right into the green, and so I have a gradation of color and actually some value because I'm putting some darker tones at the bottom of that. So I started wet on dry, but when I go back into it and start to charge that area with some more color, I start to work wet and wet. Now I'm going to move forward here. So I'm working with this area of some ground cover, some straw or hay that's growing in front of the structure and in front of these trees. And I'm going to keep the colors in this area for the most part on the cooler side, even though I have a little touch of some warm tone right there I started with. And it's not uncommon to have your cooler tones towards the back, towards the background. And in this case I actually do, in the very distant hills I have a cool blue tone, but then as I move forward it warms up, and that sun is coming through this valley or over these fields, and it's warming up some of those distant trees with some of that warmer light. But this area here that's more in the foreground is actually in a pocket almost of shadow where there's a lot of trees around, and I'm going to have a dominance in cooler tones here. So these tones are leaning more towards a blue-green, and I do that most often, as in this case, with some royal blue, some sap green, and I'll put in some touches of one of my reds if I want to neutralize it a little bit more, and I have in this case. Here again I began working wet on dry, and then I've switched over now to working wet on wet. Working wet on wet doesn't mean that you just have loose, out of control washes. You can have areas of wet paper that allows you to control where the moisture is at. Now I'm going to take my scraper again, and I'm going to pull some of this color up, and I'm creating positive shapes there, or linear marks, and I'm going to pull some of it down too, and these scraping marks that I'll be making, textures and linear marks, are actually creating negative space. And again, I think people overlook that as an option. Dried my paper. Now I'm going to come back into this area that I left the pure white of the paper. I'm going to put a bright yellow green tone here using Hansa yellow light with a touch of sap green, and then just a little bit of a blue green in the bottom to put that in shadow. I've dried that little area of light green because I want to keep a clean edge there, and I don't want this wash that I'm putting down to merge with it. So this is a mixture with sap green, some Hansa yellow light in it, some rose madder quinacridone, and I'm going to put down a big wash here. So right now I'm working with my round wash brush. And as I put these brush strokes in, I'm aware of the direction of the brush strokes that I'm making. I want to use those brush strokes to help suggest that feeling of direction of the rows and the way the crops or the straw is growing here. There's a couple areas there that the brush missed, and I'm going to leave them like that because it just brings a little bit of sparkle, brings a little balance to the composition, takes some of that light from the sky and carries it into some smaller shapes and other areas of the composition. And you'll notice I'm not trying to paint individual blades of grass here. I'm laying down a large wash to give the suggestion of this field that's got some variation in it. It has some variation of color, slight modulation of value, and I don't want to paint a whole lot of detail into this area. You have to give the viewer some place to rest, and this isn't where I want to pull the viewer into. I want it to be interesting, but I want the viewer to spend their time further back in the composition, more in towards the area where the building and the trees are, and not dwell on single blades of grass that I tried to paint here in detail in the foreground. I have my scraping tool once again, and this time I'm working on saturated paper, and I'm not trying to make distinct scrape marks because it's too wet for that. What I'm trying to do is use this to help push some pigment around, and it'll gather in areas and it'll thin out in other areas, but I'm doing it in a manner that I'm trying to give an indication of these rows. So it's another methodology for me to try and create some direction here and just reinforce the feeling of these linear rows going back at an angle here. So again, I'm not trying to make scrape marks. I'm just moving the pigment to create that feeling. Now I've dried my paper thoroughly once again, and I'm going to start to paint this structure. I have a smaller brush now. I could be using a flat brush, but I'm using a number 4 round brush. And I'm starting to put a wash down, and you can see that I'm changing up the color as I apply this wash. I'm working wet on dry, and I'm working with some royal blue with some quinacridone burnt orange, and little touches of rose madder quinacridone in there. And I just put touches of each color in here, and the mixture that looks very gray is a mixture of the royal blue with a quinacridone orange. They're opposite sides of the color wheel, and the quinacridone orange will and the royal blue will really neutralize each other and move it towards neutral gray. But I want to have some color in there still, some vibrant color, even though this is going to be in shadow. So you can see that strong area of the quinacridone burnt orange that I've left in there. And I didn't just stop on the side. This shape is continuing up, and it connects. This value connects with this other area up here. So that's one of the things that I think is hard for people at first to do, is see compounded shapes. They see one shape that one larger shape made up of many smaller elements of an object or a composition. There's a tendency to want to paint things. I want to paint the side of the building. I want to paint the shadow. I want to paint a window. I want to paint a tree. And there's a tendency to do all that separate. But often those things should be joined together in one larger shape of value. I'm going to continue bringing this darker value down to the trees, and this piece of value is connected with the side on the building there because of the shadow that I've connected it with. And now I'm going to carry that value into some of these areas on the building where there's broken boards and pieces of window that are just open holes, rectangles in the side of this. And you can see that there's a bit of warmth up in that dark value. And then as I get down here, it's getting a cooler tone. And when you're working with dark values, you still have to deal with and think about color temperature. I think too often somebody paints and they're just painting a dark value, so they think temperature doesn't matter, but you still want to try and incorporate warm and cool even into dark washes. Some of this paper is dried. Hopefully you can see there in the distant tree line there's some touches of a burnt orange, and there's some cooler greens and some warmer greens. And in the side of this building there's an area there that's that burnt orange color, and a little bit to the right it turns into a very muted cool royal blue. Now I'm going to glaze over some of the white areas here, and on this rooftop I'm putting just some clear water there. It's got just a slight tint of a gray to it, but I'm going to touch some of this burnt orange into that area that I just wet with the larger brush, and let some of this color just run in that shape. But I'm trying to maintain the direction of that roof line, contour the angle of that roof, so it helps reinforce the suggestion of the angle of the roof. Now I'll come back with a little stronger pigment, a little bit more intensity, and I'm just going to put some touches of it into the areas that I've already put some of it. Now I want to lose the pure white here on this side. There's really not a lot of pure white paper showing through in this painting. There's a few touches of areas that I'm leaving, but there's a very light sky. And if you were to look at this in terms of foreground, middle ground, background, I'm going to have a middle value here in the foreground, darker values more in the middle ground, and then lighter values in the distance. Now I want to go darker in this area. It was pretty dark to start, but I want to build another layer on top of that. and it's not going to cover the whole thing. There's going to be pieces of this first layer of paint coming through in areas. It's going to be broken up again, and you don't want to overlook in dark areas still having some steps in value. You don't want to just paint it a dark gray and leave it because it's a darker value. I think sometimes we treat the light end of the value scale and the dark end of the value scale much differently. Once we get to dark, we feel dark is good enough, and we don't have a lot of variation within the dark areas. I'm going to move around some of these areas where I have a dark value and go a little darker, a little cooler on top of what I've put down to start. So just breaking some of these shapes up even more. This is a good example where I don't want to just paint every rectangle and square just a solid tone. I want to have some variation within those smaller shapes. So just as I have with some of the washes, I'm going to continue this activity over into the area where the tree and the shrubs are. I just want to do enough brushwork to help suggest some of the edges here. I'm not outlining anything, I'm just putting down areas of value. Now I'm going to take some of that same mixture. It's a cool dark value, and I'm going to define a few of the elements on the side of this building. There's a door there, the board hanging down there. So when I first put the wash down on that side, it looked pretty dark, but as it dries, it lightens up, and you can see that I can come back here with an even darker value and build a darker layer on top of that. And you can see the variation of color from that initial wash. So I'm just building layers, but you have to do it strategically because you can't get that orange glow in that side of the building trying to do it late in the process. You can do some glazing, and you can get some of that nice integration that you get with a wet and wet. It's hard to repeat later on in the painting process. Now I'm going to get some darker values up into the tree. And you can see that the value from the void in the building and some of the dark values in the leaves on the trees or bushes there, they all just kind of connect, and that shape continues on, even though it's broken up by the nature of the brushwork that I'm doing. It makes a very irregular shape, but there's connectivity there with that value. And here I'm using the side of my brush, dragging the belly of the brush to make some marks, and I'm doing it with quick brush strokes to create that texture. I'm working wet on dry there. I don't need to try and paint tiny leaves on this tree. Just trying to give some volume to it, using again direction to give an indication of leaves and branches going away from the center of that tree. And I'm going to put just a little bit of that out here in this tree out there. Not as much as what I have going on in the foreground, because I don't want it to have the same amount of detail. I just want to give a suggestion there. I'm going to put a few just textures, directional textures here on top of these softer edges that I put down earlier. When you're painting things like this, don't just try and copy photographs and look what the photograph is there and see if you can discern if there's 5 branches or 3 branches. Be more suggestive, be more expressive, but as you paint, think about line, think about value, think about color, texture, shape, size, direction. Think about those things when you're creating your painting and when you're planning your composition. Do you have contrast of temperature? Do you have contrast of light and dark? Do you have contrast of edges? Do you have soft edges and hard edges? Do you have lines that are curved versus lines that are straight? Those are some of the things that you think about when you're composing and executing a painting. Hopefully you can see some of these brush strokes that I'm putting down here. I've got a fairly large round brush. I'm picking up some of that excess water, but as I put down those brush strokes down, I just lay those brush strokes down. I'm not noodling away with a teeny tiny brush. Here I'm using my scraper and creating some darker positive textures and patterns and shapes there, or linear marks. I'm going to pick up that moisture, excess moisture I have once again. Carry that value at the base of this area that's growing here behind the building. Just some touches of it. Broke it up a little bit. I didn't want a complete line there. And now I'm going to use my brush and just drag that quickly to create some texture, but I'm still aware of the direction that I'm making that brush stroke. And that's going to dry fairly light. Here you can see I've dried this thoroughly. I'm going to put a wash over here to put this more in shadow than what it is. Still going to break that up a little bit. I'm not just glazing over everything. And I'm going to take a lighter wash and create some variation on the boards that make up the front of this building. Here I'm going to do still doing a little dark brush marks here, but I'm going to lighten that up. And by painting these lighter valued rectangles, I'm also leaving some lighter edges where I'm not putting that glaze. So again, it breaks this area up a little bit more, makes it more interesting, and starts to define this as a broken up wall rather than a solid panel. Going to come back and put a little bit more into the rooftop here. I have that burnt orange. So those brush strokes are going the direction that the ribs and panels would be on the rooftop here. This kind of aluminum roof. And then there's some marks that I'm making that are slightly horizontal or perpendicular to the ones that are at an angle there. So now I'm coming in with some thinner lines. So what I've done so far, they've been some broader strokes, but I'm giving just a little bit of almost calligraphic linear marks here. I'm going to put a bit of a wash here to help define the perpendicular line that's going across there. Trying not to get too fussy with this rooftop. I might be getting just a little too fussy with it. I've dried this. Now I'm going to come in with a light middle value gray. This is a mixture of quinacridone burnt orange and royal blue, and it's thinned out quite a bit with water, but it still gives me a pretty good middle value. Now I'm going to take my rigger brush with one of my dark value mixtures, and I'm going to start to paint in some of the tree trunks, give an indication of the trunks and branches. I don't want to overdo it. I'm not going to get real ticky-tacky with it. I just want to have enough there to say tree. And some of it I do with a point, some of it I do with the side of it. I'll drag the side of the brush even with a rigger brush. I'm just working in a few little areas of value also with this. So creating some line, creating some texture. Here I'm dragging the side of that. I loaded that brush up and then just drug the side of the rigger brush. Spread that around a little bit. And I want to take a little bit of the same activity back here where I have a tree, and so far it hasn't really said tree. It's had this kind of floating green in the sky. And now I'm going to put a few tree trunks, a couple branches. You'll see sometimes I'll take my finger and I'll just touch an area just to break up a wash so it's not so artificial looking. Here I'm going to do just some light brushwork with a rigger, just giving some indication of some edges of boards or gaps between boards, but not a lot, not super strong edged or anything, not real dark valued, just subtle brushwork. I keep going back to the top of the building here. I want this to have a little bit more punch, so I'm coming in with a wash that has a little more intensity. Not a lot, but it's going to just take that intensity up a notch. And that's the quinacridone burnt orange. It's a real nice color. It's much more intense than a burnt sienna. I'm not happy with my tree here, with where it's at. I want it to be a more powerful shape and feel more part of this building structure. I want them to, the two shapes to be more integrated. So I'm coming in with a glaze or wash over top of this tree. I'm going to diffuse that a bit with a spray bottle and let some of that color run. And that brushwork that I've done underneath is going to come through when this is dried, but it's going to be held together more, this large area of value with this glaze over top of it. And I want to get a little darker here in the foreground also. The whole pasture or field, whatever you want to call this, is too much the same value, color, intensity. So I'm going to bring in some darker tones here in the foreground so that you can differentiate the foreground more from the middle ground area. If everything's too much the same, it gets very flat. This will dry lighter, but it will still help differentiate the foreground from the middle ground. I'm going to soften that transition a little bit with a fine mist spray. And as I do it, I'm doing it in the direction that I've been emphasizing in this area the whole time. I want to create a little bit of texture in here, so I'm taking a small round brush loaded with some paint and just tapping it on the back of my hand just to create a little bit of splatter, which will add some texture to the painting. And I'm going to put a tissue over that sky area because I really don't want that splatter to get up in that area. So I'm going to load my brush up again and tap it on the back of my hand. And it's not a lot, just a little bit to break that up a little and give it some texture. Now I'm going to take this spray bottle, which has a coarse spray, and I'm just going to spritz this and lift off just the water where it hits. It'll lift off just a little bit of the pigment, and it'll help add to the texture that I created by splattering paint with a brush. The two are going to work together to create an interesting but subtle texture in the washes that I've put down. I'm going to put a mat on this so we can get rid of the tape in the board and have a good look at it. That's my painting, Empty Nest. One of the areas I wanted to focus on was bringing the trees in this building together in one big shape, and I liked the way that came together eventually. And I also wanted to have a feeling of distance between what's going on here at this building and these trees and those distant mountains. So I think I accomplished what I was after. Hopefully you can see how I used warm and cool throughout, used light and dark, I used hard edges, I used soft edges, and a lot of variation throughout the whole composition. I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching, and if you want to subscribe to my channel, you can click on the box as well as the other boxes to see my online learning center or join my mailing list.